The morning everything changed. I was standing at my own kitchen stove, making pancakes I had made 10,000 times before, in the house I had built with my own two hands, when my daughter-in-law leaned against the doorframe in her silk robe and said words that would alter the course of all our lives forever. "Daniel," she said, her voice sharp as a blade freshly sharpened, "you need to stop eating for free." The house on Clearwater Lane. My name is Daniel Hargrove, and I am 71 years old. I say that not to invite pity, not to position myself as some fragile elder deserving of special treatment, but simply because age is context. 71 years means I have buried a wife. It means I have raised a son with hands that sometimes shook from exhaustion after double shifts at the mill. It means I have weathered 3 recessions, a cancer scare that lasted 11 months, and a kitchen renovation that nearly broke my spirit more thoroughly than any of those other things. 71 years means I have earned the right to make pancakes in my own kitchen without being ambushed at 7 in the morning. The house on Clearwater Lane was not inherited. It was not gifted. It was not stumbled upon through some fortunate accident of birth or circumstance. I built it, not metaphorically, not in the sense that people say, "I built this," when they mean they supervised and signed checks. I mean I drove the first nail. I poured concrete on weekends when my back was still young enough to forgive me for it. My late wife, Margaret, picked out every window, argued passionately for the bay window in the kitchen that let the morning light pour across the breakfast table like warm honey, and painted the shutters herself on a Saturday in October 1987, while I held the ladder and handed her brushes. We raised our son, Connor, in that house. He learned to walk in the living room, scraping his knees on the hardwood floors I had sanded myself. He carved his initials into the oak tree in the backyard when he was 8, and I pretended to be angry but secretly loved him so much for it that I could barely breathe. He grew up, went to college, fell in love, got a job that required a tie, and became, in many ways, a fine man. Margaret died 6 years ago. Breast cancer, diagnosed late, which was nobody's fault but felt like everyone's failure. She was gone in 14 months. The house, after she left it, became a quieter place than a house should ever be. Rooms held too much air. The bay window she loved threw light across an empty table. I rattled around in 4 bedrooms and 2.5 bathrooms like a single coin in a tin can. And for a while, I thought the loneliness might actually kill me more efficiently than any disease. It was Connor who suggested the arrangement, and I want to be precise about that, because later, much later, after everything unraveled, there was a great deal of revisionist history about whose idea it was, who had offered what, and who owed whom what gratitude. So let me be clear. Connor called me on a Sunday evening in March 3 years ago and said, "Dad, Vanessa and I have been talking. Our lease is up in June. What if we came to stay with you for a while? We'd help with the bills, help around the house. You shouldn't be alone in that big place." I said yes immediately, perhaps too immediately, but I missed my son and the house missed people in it, and it seemed like a solution to several problems at once. What I did not fully account for was Vanessa. The architecture of a slow erosion. Vanessa Hargrove, née Vanessa Cole, was 34 years old, professionally accomplished in some field involving digital marketing that I confess I never entirely understood, and possessed of a beauty that was immediately apparent and a temperament that revealed itself gradually, the way a weather system builds offshore before it makes landfall. In the beginning, she was perfectly pleasant. She thanked me for having them, complimented the house in that slightly clinical way people compliment things they are quietly assessing, and brought a bottle of wine their first weekend that was clearly expensive and clearly intended to signal that they were not charity cases. I appreciated the gesture and opened the wine, and the 3 of us sat on the porch I had built and watched the sun go down, and it felt briefly like abundance. The arrangement, as Connor had described it, involved them contributing to household expenses. I had waved this away initially. They were my son and his wife, not tenants. But Connor had been insistent, and we settled on an amount that was modest but meaningful, more symbolic than practical given that I owned the house outright and my pension and social security covered my actual needs. But within 4 months, the contributions had become irregular. Within 6, they had stopped entirely. I did not raise the issue. I am not, by nature, a man who raises issues. Margaret used to say, with equal parts affection and exasperation, that I would let a roof collapse rather than ask someone to help me fix it. She was not wrong. So I said nothing about the money, and I continued buying groceries, because I had always bought groceries, and feeding people had always felt like an act of love rather than a financial transaction. This was, I would come to understand, a mistake. Not because generosity is wrong, but because there are people in the world for whom generosity, if it goes unacknowledged long enough, quietly transforms in their minds into entitlement. They stop seeing what you give. They begin to see only what you are in their private accounting, costing them your presence, your habits, your noise, your existence in spaces they have mentally begun to redecorate as their own. Vanessa had begun redecorating long before I noticed. It happened in increments so small they were individually invisible. She rearranged the living room for better flow without asking me, which I accepted because the new arrangement was genuinely better, and I am not sentimental about furniture. She replaced the kitchen towels with new ones, which I accepted because the old ones were fraying. She commented once that the wallpaper in the hallway was dated. I agreed that it was, and she took my agreement as an invitation to strip it herself over a weekend, while Connor and I watched football, presenting me with a finished wall, painted a shade of gray she described as grayish, and that I privately thought looked like a rainy day had gotten indoors. None of these things on their own were wars. Together they were a campaign. The comments about money began appearing, subtle and deniable, like cracks in old plaster. Vanessa mentioning, while I was cooking dinner, that organic groceries were expensive. Vanessa nodding that the utility bills had been higher than expected. Vanessa remarking that the neighborhood's property taxes were apparently increasing. In a tone that implied I should find this information relevant to my behavior in ways she left deliberately unstated. And Connor, my son, my boy with the initials carved into the oak tree, said nothing. He nodded when Vanessa spoke, or looked at his phone, or excused himself to take work calls. I do not know if he was complicit or simply conflict-averse, and I am not sure the distinction matters as much as I once thought it did. I began eating my breakfasts earlier, getting up at 6 before either of them came downstairs so that my presence in the kitchen would not occasion comment. I began buying my own separate groceries, a private shelf in the refrigerator, coated by nothing but shame, so that Vanessa could not track, even theoretically, what I was consuming from the household supply. I began, in short, behaving like a guest in my own home, the home I built. The home with Margaret's bay window, throwing light across a table that was increasingly not mine. I told myself this was peacekeeping, that this was what families did, made accommodations, absorbed discomforts, prioritized harmony over pride. I told myself Margaret would have found a way to smooth things over, though in truth, Margaret would have had the entire situation sorted in a direct, warm, and completely non-negotiable conversation within the first month, because Margaret had always been braver than me about the things that mattered. I missed her especially badly that year. The morning of the pancakes. The Tuesday it happened was an ordinary Tuesday in every respect, except that it was the Tuesday things ended. I had woken at 5:30, which is my natural time, had made coffee, and decided, in a small, private act of defiance against nothing in particular, to make pancakes. Margaret's recipe, committed to memory 30 years ago, involving buttermilk and a particular ratio of baking powder to baking soda that she had argued was the ratio, and that I had never once questioned. I made them on Saturday mornings when Connor was growing up. I made them on the morning of my wedding anniversary every year, even now, even alone, because some rituals are for the person who keeps them rather than for the audience. I was standing at the stove, the batter mixed, the griddle warming, when I heard Vanessa's footsteps on the stairs. This was earlier than her usual hour, and I registered mild surprise but nothing more. I said good morning without turning around. She did not return the greeting. Then, Daniel, you need to stop eating for free. I turned from the stove slowly. Vanessa was standing in the doorway in a silk robe the color of pale gold, her hair pulled up, her expression the particular expression of someone who has been rehearsing a conversation and has decided this is the moment to deliver it. Her arms were crossed. She looked, I thought, simultaneously like someone with great confidence and someone who had constructed that confidence out of material that would not survive close inspection. I beg your pardon, I said, not because I had not heard her. I had heard her perfectly. We're paying the bills here, she said. The groceries, the utilities. Connor's salary is basically keeping this household going. And you're just living here, eating, not contributing. We can't keep subsidizing your retirement. I want to record, for the sake of accuracy, what I felt in that moment. It was not rage, though rage would have been entirely appropriate. It was something more complicated, a convergence of sadness and clarity, the way weather fronts meet and the air between them becomes electric. I felt the weight of 3 years of small surrenders. I felt Margaret's bay window at my back. I felt the floor beneath my feet, the floor I had laid, the floor that bore my weight now as it had borne my weight for more than 3 decades. And beneath all of that, I felt something else. A door closing on the person I had been for 3 years and opening on the person I had always been before that. The man who had built things, who had not apologized for existing, who had never once needed to earn the right to stand in his own kitchen. I turned back to the stove. I finished the pancake I had been making. I plated it. I poured myself more coffee. I did all of these things with great deliberateness, in the particular silence of a man who is choosing his next action very carefully. Then I said, without turning around, I'd like you to call Connor downstairs, Vanessa. There's something I should have told you both a long time ago. What had been left unsaid. Connor came downstairs in 15 minutes, confused and carrying his phone, dressed for work. He looked between his wife and me with the expression of a man who had learned through long experience that when these 2 poles of his life occupied the same room at early morning, something was wrong. Dad, what's going on? I gestured to the table. They sat. I remained standing, not to be theatrical, but because I was still cooking, and because it was my kitchen and I would stand in it if I pleased. Your wife has raised a concern, I said, about financial arrangements in this household. I think it's time to have an honest conversation about that. Vanessa straightened in her chair with the righteous posture of someone who felt they were about to be vindicated. Connor looked wary. She's right that the current arrangement isn't sustainable, Vanessa said, pressing her advantage, apparently emboldened by the opening. We've talked about this between ourselves. If you want to continue living here, we think you should formalize something. Sign the house over to Connor. Make it official. You're not getting any younger, and eventually there's going to be estate stuff to deal with, and it would be cleaner. Vanessa, Connor's voice was low. We said we'd discuss. She's been thorough, I said. I was still at the stove. I turned, finally, and looked at them both, my son, who would not meet my eyes, and his wife, who met mine steadily, with the certainty of someone who believes the terrain favors them. She's been thorough, and she's made several assumptions, and I want to address all of them. I pulled out the chair at the head of the table, Margaret's chair, actually. But I had begun sitting in it after she died because proximity to her chair was a kind of company, and I sat down. First, I said, the question of who is paying for what in this house. Connor, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. In the last 12 months, what have you actually paid toward this household? Connor's jaw worked. He named a figure. It was, as I had known it would be, substantially smaller than the figure Vanessa had implied when she said his salary was basically keeping this household going. It was, in fact, smaller than 4 months of what we had originally agreed upon, accounting for the 8 months when they had paid nothing at all. "I see," I said. "And Vanessa, when you said I was eating for free, could you walk me through your calculation? Because my recollection is that I have been purchasing my own groceries separately for the last 14 months to avoid any possibility of exactly this accusation. I have receipts, if it's helpful." This was something that gave Vanessa visible pause. She had not, apparently, realized I had been doing this. "The utilities," she began. "My name is on the utility accounts," I said. "My name has been on them since 1989. I pay them through automatic withdrawal from my account, as I have always done. The property taxes are paid," I said, "by me, quarterly, as they have been since 1987. A silence fell across the kitchen. Outside, the morning was proceeding without any awareness of the conversation inside it. A bird was doing something optimistic in the oak tree with Connor's initials. "Dad," Connor started. "I'm not finished," I said, and my son, to his credit, stopped. "The suggestion that you'd like me to sign the house over to Connor, I want to make sure I understand that proposal. You'd like me to give you the asset that represents my entire life's work and my only significant financial security in exchange for what, exactly? The privilege of continuing to live in it." Vanessa's expression shifted. I watched something recalibrate behind her eyes. She had come into this conversation holding what she believed were the cards, and she was realizing slowly that she had been playing at a table whose stakes she had fundamentally misunderstood. "I didn't mean it to sound." "I know how you meant it," I said, and I was surprised by how gentle my voice was. I had expected anger, had braced for it, but what came out instead was something sadder and more tired. "I've watched you mean it for 3 years, Vanessa. One small thing at a time, and I let it happen, which is my fault more than yours because I should have spoken sooner." I went to my bedroom after breakfast, my bedroom, in my house, and I retrieved a manila folder from the top shelf of my closet. Inside it were documents I had not looked at in years because I had never needed to. The original deed to the property, in my name and Margaret's name, with a right of survivorship provision that had transferred full ownership to me upon her death. The mortgage satisfaction document from 2003, when I had made the final payment, a day I remembered with a specific, private pride that I had never fully shared with anyone because there was something almost sacred about it. Property tax records, insurance documents, the original building permits from 1987, some of them slightly water-damaged at the corners, still fully legible. I carried this folder back to the kitchen table. They were still sitting there, Connor with his coffee, Vanessa with the particular stillness of someone who has decided that motion in any direction might be wrong. I placed the folder on the table and opened it. I did not make a speech about it. I simply turned the documents so they could be read and let them speak in the language of recorded fact, which is a language with no ambiguity and no revisionist interpretation. Connor looked at the mortgage satisfaction document for a long time. "I didn't know you'd paid it off," he said quietly. 2003, I said. "You were finishing high school. I didn't make a big deal of it." "Dad, I'm sorry." His voice cracked on the second word, and I believe him still. I think Connor had been sliding towards something he didn't fully see, the way you can stand at the top of a long slope and not recognize it as a slope until you're already moving. This whole thing should have been handled differently. "Yes," I said, "it should have." Vanessa had not spoken. I looked at her steadily, without malice, because what I felt was not malice. What I felt was simply clarity, the clarity of a person who has stopped performing a role that was never theirs to perform. "I don't want you to leave," I said to her, which surprised her visibly. "Connor is my son. This house has more rooms than I need. The practical arrangement that brought you here was not a bad idea, but it needs to be an honest arrangement, which means we all need to understand what this house is and what it isn't. It isn't yours. It may never be yours. What happens to it when I'm gone is a decision I will make in my own time, on my own terms, guided by my own values. That is not a hostile statement. It is simply a fact. I let that sit for a moment. The second thing, I continued, is that I will not be made to feel like a burden in my own home. I am 71 years old. I get up early. I make pancakes. I have opinions about where the furniture goes. None of these things are an imposition on you. They are the ordinary expressions of a person living in the place where he lives. If that is not something you can share space with comfortably, then we have a different conversation to have. But this one, the one where I'm eating for free in a house I built, is over. What happened next was not the dramatic conclusion that stories like these sometimes promise. There was no thunderous reckoning, no packed bags, no slamming doors. Life, in my experience, is rarely that cinematically satisfying. What happened was smaller and more real. Connor and Vanessa went upstairs. They stayed up there for a long time. I heard voices, not the content, just the rhythm of a difficult conversation being had, which is its own distinct sound. I washed the dishes. I ate my pancakes, which had grown cold but were still buttermilk and still Margaret's and still mine. When they came back downstairs, Vanessa was no longer in the silk robe. She was dressed, her face composed in the way of someone who has made a decision or had one made for her. She sat at the kitchen table, on the side, not at the head, where I was sitting, and she looked at her hands for a moment before she looked at me. "I think I've been unfair to you," she said. It came out with the effort of something that had cost her, which I respected. I convinced myself of a version of things that wasn't true, and I let it build up into something I shouldn't have said. She glanced at Connor, then back to me. "I'm sorry, Daniel." I accepted this. I am not a man who requires sustained penance, and I could see that it was genuine, or genuine enough. "Then we start over," I said, "with honest terms." The honest terms were these. They would pay a fair and consistent monthly amount, not tokenism and not rent, but an acknowledgement that 4 walls and a roof and heat and a kitchen have value. I would remain fully in my home, at my table in my kitchen, at whatever hour I chose to make whatever I chose to make. Major decisions about the house, renovations, significant changes, would involve my voice as the final word, because it was my house, and that fact was not subject to emotional renegotiation. And we would, the 3 of us, make a genuine attempt to live together like adults who respected one another, which meant honesty before it meant comfort. Connor shook my hand when we were done talking, which seemed formal and exactly right. Vanessa made coffee, mine the way I like it, which she had apparently noted at some point without my knowing, and set it in front of me without ceremony, which I took as its own kind of statement. What I learned at 71. I am not writing this as a cautionary tale, though it is that. I am not writing it to vilify Vanessa, who is a complicated person in the way that most people are complicated, capable of small cruelties and genuine regret, capable of building stories that serve her, and then, when pressed, of setting those stories down. I am writing it because of what happened at the stove on that Tuesday morning, the moment before I turned around, the moment I felt the floor beneath my feet. There is a particular danger that descends on people my age, on people who have survived loss, on people who have watched the world rearrange itself around their absence, which is the danger of apologizing for existing, of shrinking, of confusing love with self-erasure, confusing peacekeeping with surrender. I had spent 3 years making myself smaller in a house that was entirely mine, because I was afraid that taking up space would cost me my son's presence. And what I learned was that it had only cost me my own. Margaret would have laughed at me, lovingly and at length, but she would have laughed. The house on Clearwater Lane is still mine. The bay window still throws morning light across the breakfast table. The oak tree in the backyard still holds Connor's initials, deeper now than when he was 8, grown into the wood the way time grows into everything. I make pancakes on Saturday mornings and on anniversaries and on random Tuesdays when the spirit moves me. My son lives here. His wife lives here. We are, the three of us, something that takes effort to maintain, like all things worth having. There are still moments of friction. There will always be moments of friction, because people are people and houses are shared and life is long. But the framework is honest now, and honesty, I have found, is a foundation that holds weight in a way that silence never does. I am Daniel Hargrove. I am 71 years old. I built this house. And some mornings, when the light comes through the window just so, and the batter is mixed and the griddle is hot, I swear I can hear Margaret laughing at me, somewhere just past the edge of hearing, warm and familiar and entirely right. I flip the pancakes. I let them cook. I eat them at my own table in my own kitchen in the home I built, and I taste something that is not quite grief and not quite happiness but is, I think, closer to both than I have any right to expect. That is enough. That has always been enough.